Hi, my name is Jennifer Blevins. Thank you for the opportunity to present my problem of practice today. The title, Exploring Employee Perceptions of Organizational Change Effectiveness Within a United States Navy Command. My study explores how civilian employees in a U.S. Navy command experience and interpret change, what helps, what hinders, and what becomes part of the organization's culture. My faculty advisor is Dr. Stephen Vaughn. I will start today by outlining the problem that shaped this study and briefly summarizing the literature that frames it. From there, I will explain the study's purpose and introduce the research question, followed by the framework and the methodology I used, then to the findings and their connection to the literature. Next will be the implications and recommendations for key decision makers, the limitations and delimitations of the study, and the distribution plan are next. I will close with the references used in today's presentation. The problem driving this study is straightforward but consequential. The U.S. Navy has struggled to implement organizational change effectively and consistently, with ripple effects on operational readiness, adaptability, and national security. The failure to implement change affects the U.S. Navy's ability to operate efficiently and respond to evolving challenges and threats. This is the basis for my study. The literature grounding this study spans three connected areas: what drives successful change in military organization, what commonly derails it, and the process models that guide implementation. Together, these bodies of work help explain why the U.S. Navy's change efforts often struggle and what conditions allow them to succeed. First, the literature shows that successful change in military settings depends on three things: structured communication that explains the why, early and sustained employee engagement, and visible, credible leadership commitment. Defense and public sector studies emphasize that when leaders connect strategic intent to daily work, invite feedback, and highlight early verifiable wins, organizations maintain readiness while adapting effectively. Kaw et al. Argue that leadership commitment through presence, resources, and modeling signals credibility and helps change survive rotations. Second, the literature identifies recurring barriers that complicate change in commands, strong traditions that reinforce the status quo, frequent leadership turnover that disrupts continuity, and complex multi-echelon decision processes that dilute ownership. These conditions increase the risk of fragmented rollouts, inconsistent documentation, and employee skepticism, especially when changes are announced quickly without operational grounding. Kamara explains how leadership tenure and rotation disrupt continuity and resets priorities midstream. Third, process models, especially Kotter's 8-step organizational change model, offers a practical roadmap to change. The literature shows that Kotter's model works in military context when adapted to real-world constraints. Kaufman et al. Emphasize guiding coalitions that include operational SMEs, not just formal leaders. Tasloose et al. Show that anchoring occurs when changes are documented, trained, and reinforced, not simply announced. The purpose of my study was to explore employee perceptions of organizational change effectiveness within a U.S. Navy command. The focus is on lived experience, how change is communicated, enacted, and sustained from the vantage point of non-supervisory human resources professionals. The study centered on one question: what are employee perceptions regarding the effectiveness of organizational change within a United States Navy command? Asking it openly allows participants to define what effective meant in their own environment, moving beyond policy intent to the realities of daily work. I anchored this study in Kotter's 2012 organizational change model, an 8-step framework. for change. I use Cotter steps both for first cycle coding and as an analytical lens to interpret patterns. At the same time, I stayed mindful of critiques that real-world change is iterative, sometimes nonlinear, and shaped by informal networks. Patterns that also emerged in my findings. Now for my methodology. I used a qualitative, holistic, single-case design to gain depth, not breadth, within my site. This approach fits complex bounded organizational settings where the case functions as a coherent site of practice. I conducted semi-structured interviews and a focus group using instruments aligned with Cotter's OCM. I tested and refined the protocols to ensure clarity and flow. The site was a U.S. Navy command with about 200 employees performing human resources work. Using the purposive criterion sampling method, I recruited 4 non-supervisory HR employees, each with at least 2 years at the command, to ensure rich and relevant perspectives. Pseudonyms were used to protect confidentiality. 3 cross-cutting themes emerged that answered the research question. Theme 1, the disconnect between strategic intent and operational reality. Participants consistently described strategic decisions as out of sync with frontline work. Decisions were often made without consulting those who would carry them out, leading to confusion, disengagement, and reduced trust. Theme 2, leaders and SMEs as foundations for change. Participants emphasized that effective change depended on leaders and SMEs who understood the work and stayed close to operations. But leadership engagement was inconsistent and SMEs were often let out of formal decision-making. Theme 3, gap-driven employee-initiated documentation. Because formal guidance was often missing during change efforts, employees created their own SOPs, checklists, and tools. In the absence of official direction, personnel relied on peer support, informal knowledge sharing, and self-developed resources to keep work moving. Taken together, these themes show that effective organizational change in military settings requires leadership proximity, strategic clarity, and communication practices that genuinely empower their personnel. On to theme connections to the literature. Theme 1 aligned with the literature, showing that military organizations face abrupt transitions, limited information, and constant pressure to stay adaptable. Participants describe pushing through unclear directives to maintain continuity, reflecting the readiness and resilience highlighted in studies of military change. Where Theme 1 diverged was in communication. The literature calls for structured, deliberate processes, but participants experienced reactive, fragmented communication, often learning about changes the night before they occurred or through rumors. Theme 2 aligns strongly with the literature on leadership credibility, employee engagement, and the role of SMEs. Participants emphasized that SMEs held the weight of the work, echoing research showing that effective change depends on leaders and influencers with deep operational knowledge. They also stressed the need for leaders who stay visible and engaged, consistent with studies linking leadership presence to trust and readiness. Where Theme 2 diverged was in the inconsistent visibility of formal leaders. Participants described leaders who were distant and often unaware of frontline realities. Theme 3 aligned with the literature showing that structured processes, documentation, and knowledge transfer are essential for sustaining change. Participants described creating their own SOPs and checklists, which mirrors research emphasizing that clear processes support readiness and consistency. Where Theme 3 diverged was in how documentation happened. The literature points to formal systems and codified policies, but participants relied on word of mouth rather than official channels. Implications and recommendations. For command leadership, This study makes one message unmistakably clear. Command leadership must close the gap between strategic intent and the day-to-day reality of our workforce. Going forward, leaders need to ground every change effort in strategic clarity and operational relevance. For HR supervisors, this study showed that much of what keeps commands running is not formally documented. It is created by employees who step in to fill the gaps. Commands should formally recognize and integrate this employee-generated documentation. HR supervisors and subject matter experts should guide that process so the organization benefits from the knowledge already being created. For change strategists and policy developers, the success of change efforts depended less on formal models and more on the leaders and experts who brought those models to life. Commands should intentionally center these leaders and experts in the planning, communication, and implementation of change. Involving them early ensures that strategies reflect real conditions, not abstract assumptions. For limitations, the first is the potential for researcher bias. Because qualitative research relies on interpretation, I use reflexivity and member checking to stay objective, but my own perspective may still have influenced how I interpreted the data. Second, the study depended on participants' willingness to share. Their comfort levels, communication styles, and personal perspectives shape the depth of the information they provided. For delimitations, the first is the exclusive use of Kotter's OCM framework to keep the analysis focused and consistent. Second, I used a small sample size so the findings do not represent the entire U.S. Navy. Finally, I used purposive sampling, speaking only with individuals who met specific criteria, which narrowed the scope to those most relevant to the research. I will share these results with 3 groups who can put them into practice. First, I'll brief command leadership, focusing on closing the strategy and operations gap, publishing the what, when, why upfront, forming SME inclusive guiding coalitions early, and using time phase rollouts with feedback gates. Second, I will lead a professional development workshop for HR supervisors. This is to help supervisors standardize documentation and communication. We'll turn strong employee-authored job aids into living SOPs, use a simple version control template, and adopt a consistent 5 W's communication protocol. Third, I will write a practitioner article for organizational change strategists and policy developers. This will be to highlight SME-led pilots, multi-channel communication plans, and lesson learned gates before enterprise rollout of change. The next slides list the references used throughout this presentation. I would like to end with, employees judge change by whether they receive timely, clarity, credible leadership, and usable guidance to do their jobs. When strategy, SMEs, and documentation move together, change takes root, and sailors are better served. Thank you.